When a person becomes indistinguishable from their persona, they are no longer living from the core of their being, but instead from a mask shaped by external expectations. The persona is a necessary construct. It allows us to navigate society, to take part in communal life, to play roles as parents, professionals, teachers, students, or citizens. But it is a role, nonetheless, not the whole person. The danger arises when the individual becomes completely identified with his persona and loses touch with what lies behind it. In the beginning, it may appear harmless, even beneficial. A young man may become a doctor and take on the comportment expected of him. Serious, dependable, empathetic, he wears his mask well. But over time, if he never questions this image, never steps outside it, and never listens to his deeper feelings, he risks confusing the image with his identity. He is no longer a man who practices medicine. He becomes only the doctor. The deeper layers of the psyche begin to suffocate behind this hardened shell. Feelings that don't align with the image are pushed down. Desires that contradict the mask or ignored or shamed. The person begins to live not in accordance with what they actually feel or value, but in accordance with what the mask demands. To deviate from the script becomes frightening. Even minor cracks in the persona feel like existential threats. There is no longer room for play, for doubt, for contradiction. Everything becomes performance. The soul shrinks in the presence of such rigidity. When the image becomes more real than the man, then anything that contradicts it must be either denied or hidden. This identification is often subtle. It does not announce itself loudly. The person may seem entirely functional, even admirable. In fact, society often rewards this fusion between identity and role. Promotions, respect, status, they all reinforce the illusion that this person is their persona. But behind the curtain, the individual begins to suffer. He may not even know why. There is a kind of deadness, a loss of spontaneity, a slow dimming of vitality. He no longer knows how to play or to cry or to be genuinely surprised. Everything is filtered through the image. He is always on, even when alone. This constant self-monitoring is exhausting, and over time it gives rise to feelings of meaninglessness or depression. When this over-identification deepens, the person becomes incapable of intimacy. To love requires vulnerability, and the persona cannot be vulnerable. It must be composed, consistent, perfect. The person behind the mask, meanwhile, begins to feel like a ghost, present but unseen, voiceless. Relationships become strained because the persona cannot truly connect. It only performs connection. The spouse or friend may begin to feel they are speaking to a facade, not to a living soul, and they are right. The person may appear outwardly successful, admired, and stable, but inwardly there is a growing gap between image and reality, and the soul suffers in that void. This condition often begins early in life. As children, we quickly learn which aspects of our personality win approval and which bring rejection. We shape ourselves to fit into our families, our cultures, our schools. This shaping is natural and necessary to some extent, but if the child never learns to distinguish between the adapted self and the authentic self, then the mask hardens too soon. What begins as survival becomes identity. The boy who was always praised for being obedient becomes the man who cannot say no. The girl who learned to smile even when she was sad becomes the woman who cannot cry even when grieving. Over time, these personas become so habitual that they seem like the real me, but they are not. They are the face we wear to be accepted. This identification becomes especially dangerous in adulthood, when life demands greater complexity and inner depth. The person who clings to the persona may find themselves deeply disoriented when life confronts them with crisis, loss, or change. A man who sees himself only as strong and independent may collapse inwardly when faced with a situation where he must ask for help. A woman who sees herself only as a caretaker may fall into depression when her children leave home and she no longer has anyone to serve. These moments are not merely external challenges, they are psychic ruptures. They expose the thinness of the persona and reveal how little connection the person has to their inner world. Without that connection, such crises feel like annihilation. Another manifestation of this over-identification is the inability to admit confusion, ambivalence, or inner conflict. The persona thrives on clarity, confidence, and control. It cannot tolerate ambiguity. But the soul is not so simple. The inner life is filled with contradictions. One may love and hate the same person. One may desire freedom and fear it. One may feel strong in one moment and fragile in the next. These tensions are the material of inner growth. But the person who is merged with the persona will suppress these feelings because they threaten the image. As a result, the individual remains psychologically immature. Growth requires friction, and friction requires access to the whole range of one's inner life. Eventually, the psyche begins to rebel. What has been ignored or denied refuses to stay buried. Symptoms emerge: anxiety, compulsions, emptiness, or inexplicable mood swings. These are not random malfunctions of the mind. They are signals from the soul, knocking on the door that has long been closed. The tragedy is that the person may respond by tightening the mask further, believing that what is needed is more discipline, more control, more performance. But what is actually needed is the courage to take off the mask, to feel what lies beneath, to listen to the parts of the self that have been exiled. The process of separating from the persona is not easy. It requires loss, the loss of certainty, the loss of approval, the loss of the identity one has clung to for so long. It also requires humility. One must admit that the mask has been necessary, but is no longer sufficient. The person must begin the difficult journey inward to discover who they are apart from what they appear to be. This is not a journey of abandoning all roles, but of no longer confusing the role with the soul. It is not uncommon for such individuals to resist this process until something external forces it upon them: a breakdown, a betrayal, a death, or a failure. Only when the persona cracks do they begin to glimpse the self that has waited patiently behind it. That moment, though painful, is also sacred. It is the beginning of individuation, the slow return to wholeness. But for those who refuse this calling, who cling to the mask as if it were their true face, the danger is profound. Not the danger of being disliked or unsuccessful, but the danger of never truly living. They become echoes of expectation, reflections of what others want, but never a voice of their own truth. The soul does not die, but it retreats, waiting for a more honest encounter. And until that happens, the person will continue to live behind the mask, admired, perhaps, but deeply alone. Possession by the unconscious occurs when a person becomes overtaken by forces within themselves that they do not understand, cannot control, and have never dared to confront. It is not madness in the clinical sense, but rather a slow erosion of the boundary between the ego, the conscious center of the personality, and the deep autonomous regions of the psyche. In such a state, the individual is no longer acting from intention or reflection, but from compulsion. They speak words they later regret, form judgments with no foundation, and are carried by moods and fantasies as though swept away by a river whose source remains hidden. These are not merely emotional outbursts or lapses in judgment. They are signs that the ego has been displaced from its rightful position and something older, deeper, more primal has stepped in to take its place. The unconscious, when ignored or denied, does not remain passive. It is not a quiet storage space of forgotten memories or unused potentials. It is alive, intelligent, and often contradictory. It carries instincts, inherited patterns, emotional truths, and repressed material. It also houses the complexes, clusters of emotionally charged ideas and experiences that operate independently of the ego. These complexes have their own will, their own voice, and their own intentions. When a complex is triggered, the person may act entirely out of character. A normally calm man might explode in rage. A confident woman might collapse in anxiety. A loving parent might say something cruel to their child and later feel as if someone else had spoken through them. This is possession, the experience of being overrun by a fragment of the psyche that has broken loose from the center. So, the most dangerous aspect of possession is that it often goes unrecognized by the one who is possessed. The person feels justified, righteous, or certain. They believe they are fully aware, fully rational, fully in control. But if one were to step back and observe their behavior, a different picture would emerge. The tone of voice changes. The eyes take on a different quality. The language becomes exaggerated or hollow. There is often a sense of emotional inflation, a surge of feeling or conviction that is disproportionate to the situation. These are not conscious choices. They are symptoms of an inner event. The ego has been displaced and another psychic center has emerged to dominate the personality. In mythological terms, possession is often depicted as being overtaken by a god or demon. In psychological terms, these gods are symbolic representations of inner forces, archetypes, instincts, ancestral patterns. When the ego is weak, uncentered, or blind to its own limits, it becomes vulnerable to these inner invasions. The person may be possessed by a hunger for power, a desire for control, an overwhelming fear, or an unrelenting grief. The original feeling or impulse may be understandable or even justified, but once possession takes place, it grows beyond proportion. It begins to feed on itself, drawing more psychic energy into its orbit until the person becomes a servant to the very force they once believed they were managing. Possession can also be collective. Entire groups, movements, or cultures can be overtaken by an unconscious drive. In such cases, individuals surrender their critical faculties to a larger emotional field. Rational thought becomes suspect. Dissent becomes betrayal. The group identity becomes sacred, and anyone outside of it becomes a threat. In this way, the unconscious extends its grip beyond the individual and shapes the behavior of masses. Propaganda, ideology, and fanaticism are all expressions of collective possession. What begins in the psyche of one person spreads like wildfire when others share the same vulnerabilities, the same repressed fears, the same unmet needs. At the individual level, possession often takes root in people who have neglected the development of self-awareness. The more alienated a person is from their inner life, the more vulnerable they are to unconscious takeover. If someone has spent years ignoring their anger, it may one day erupt as blind rage. If they have denied their capacity for envy or deceit, these qualities may begin to leak out in subtle, corrosive ways. The psyche, like nature, does not tolerate imbalance indefinitely. What is pushed down must eventually rise, and when it does, it rarely returns in a gentle or manageable form. It arrives as a storm, sudden and total. The experience of being possessed is often followed by shame or confusion. The person may say, I don't know why I did that, or that wasn't like me. In truth, it was like them, it was a part of them, long disowned. Possession is never caused by something alien, it always comes from within. But because that part of the self was never integrated, it acts like a stranger. The goal of inner work is not to destroy these parts, but to bring them into consciousness, to make them known, understood, and integrated into a fuller self. When one learns to recognize the early signs of possession, the tightening of emotion, the irrational certainty, the sudden shifts in perception, one can begin to pause, to reflect, to ask, who is speaking now? What part of me has taken the reins? There is also a seductive aspect to possession. Some people enjoy the intensity it brings. They feel more alive, more certain, more powerful when carried by the force of an unconscious complex. This is especially true in moments of collective emotion, protests, movements, revolutions, where the boundary between self and other dissolves and one feels swept up in something greater. But the exhilaration is fleeting and the consequences often dire. The individual must return to themselves, to the quiet and difficult work of distinguishing inner voices, sorting truth from projection, and claiming responsibility for their own actions. Possession is not always destructive in appearance. It can come in a form of spiritual inflation, moral superiority, or excessive kindness. A person might believe they are acting from love, when in fact they are driven by a need to be needed. They might believe they are being prophetic, when in fact they are overtaken by unconscious fantasies. In each case, the danger lies in the lack of reflection. The person does not examine their motives, does not question the force that animates them. They are certain, they are cold, they are no longer in dialogue with their psyche, but in service to a single dominant voice within it. The path out of possession is through awareness, not intellectual awareness alone, but a living confrontation with the unconscious. This means paying attention to dreams, to slips of the tongue, to sudden emotions, to bodily reactions. It means creating space for silence, for self-examination, for honest dialogue with what one would rather not see. It means realizing that the psyche is not a monologue, but a chorus of voices, some familiar, some ancient. To be human is to hold this complexity, to endure the tension between opposites, and to grow through the struggle of making the unconscious conscious. The ego must learn humility. It must recognize its limitations. It must be strong enough to stand at the center, but flexible enough to listen to what lies beyond. Possession occurs when the ego believes itself either too powerful or too powerless. In truth, it is neither. It is a steward of the greater psyche, not its master. When the ego lives in respectful relationship to the unconscious, when it accepts the need for inner dialogue, for reflection, for transformation, it can begin to integrate the forces that once overtook it. It can reclaim its rightful place, not as ruler, but as participant in the unfolding mystery of the self. To walk through life without recognizing the forces that stir within us is to remain at the mercy of unseen hands. A person who identifies only with their image, or who becomes unknowingly possessed by unexamined instincts and forgotten memories, is not truly free. They are governed by what they refuse to confront. The signs we have explored are not merely dangers in others, but mirrors for ourselves. Every mask worn too long, every shadow denied, every emotion that takes hold without our consent, all of these signal the deeper call, the call to become whole. This journey requires honesty, courage, and an unflinching willingness to meet what lies within, even when it disturbs the comfortable illusions we live by. It is not the absence of darkness that brings wisdom, but the ability to face it without flinching, and in doing so, to retrieve the lost pieces of our soul. Thank you for walking this path of depth and reflection. May your search for inner truth be met with clarity, and your courage to face yourself be your greatest strength. Trust the quiet voice within. It knows the way. Good luck on your journey.